So, on Wednesday morning, because it's been so lovely outside, as Sally has said earlier, on Wednesday morning I was walking our 6-year-old daughter, Selah, to school. And on this walk, we started to have this kind of serious conversation, and she started asking me these big questions, like about my life and my work. And one of her big questions was, "Pops, I just don't understand. Why can't you just stay home every day and hang out with us?" And so I started explaining to Selah that I actually have 3 jobs and one big overarching job. And see, my first job is to be husband, to be a husband to Tammy, to be a husband to Mama, to be the best husband I can be. And then my second job, it's kind of related. It's to be Pops, to be the best Poppy I can be to you and Shiloh and Breck. And then my third job is to be one of the pastors here at St. Luke's and in this community. And I'm explaining all this, and I'm thinking she's getting it. And I told Selah, I said, but I also have this big overall job, overarching thing. And that is to be faithful to the one God has called me to be faithful to that person, be faithful to that path. And I said, Selah, you also have that job. You have to be faithful to the person God is calling you to be. And I actually believe that it's your job too. And it's not just your job, it's a we thing, because it's not just an individual question, it's about a communal thing. And so we always have to be asking these 2 questions. Who are we? And who are we called to be in this world? And so what I'd like to do this morning is look at a scripture from Matthew chapter 25. Stephanie talked a little bit about this passage. It comes from Matthew's gospel. If you were in Godspell, or if you saw Godspell, this short story, also known as a parable, this will be very familiar to you. In this story, Jesus is talking to his disciples. And this has everything to do with who are we and who are we called to be in this world. Here's how he tells the story, 31 through 40, chapter 25. Now when the human one comes in his majesty, and all of his angels are with him, he will sit on his majestic throne. All the nations will be gathered in front of him. He will separate them from each other, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right side, but the goats he will put on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who will receive good things from my Father. Inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world began. I was hungry and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." Then those who are righteous will reply to him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and give you clothes to wear? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" Then the king will reply to them, "I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me." Now first, just a couple of interesting things about this passage, interesting also regarding my relationship with this scripture. As many of you know, I grew up in the conservative evangelical church of the Midwest, and I can honestly tell you, I don't ever remember hearing this scripture preached on. I don't ever remember a sermon on this scripture. I don't ever remember diving deep into this passage. Maybe we came across it in our daily devotions at some point. But when it came to this text, we just ignored it. Just ignore it. And see, I think the reason we did that, and looking back, is because we had this salvation framework. Like, to be saved, it's all about what you believe up here. It's all about having the right doctrine. And did you ask Jesus into your heart? And see, what's interesting is, when I started growing out of the evangelical church and went to college and seminary and then grew into the United Methodist Church, the mainline world, what I noticed is when this scripture is read in more progressive, liberal Christian circles, they always see themselves as the cuddly little sheep. Is it true? And see, what else is interesting about this Lots of people will come to this story and they'll read it in such a way that it's a description about what happens to you when you die. If you're a sheep, if you're good, if you played the game the right way, well, then you get a great reward. You inherit the kingdom. But if you're a goat, the prognosis isn't so good. You inherit suffering. In fact, if we were to read the end of the story, the king says, "Get away from me, you people who do terrible things. Go to the place of fire." And you see, and then there's lots of people who will say things like, "Oh man, God of judgment, God of anger, I just can't believe in that kind of God. I just can't do that kind of God." And I have to tell you, on most days I am right there with you. We have plenty of judgmental attitudes in this world. We have plenty of anger in this world, and anger doesn't usually get us lots of places. Oh man, I just can't do the God of judgment. I get it. Until we hear a story. Until we hear the story of another major oil spill. Or until we hear the story of another politician who's caught up in some sort of scandal. Or until we hear the story of another woman who's been sexually assaulted. See, then all of a sudden, that God of judgment looks pretty good. All of a sudden, we proclaim the God of judgment. Oh, but I just can't do the God of anger. I just can't do that God. Until we hear a story of another child being forced into prostitution, or the story of another country starving while its warlords hoard over the food supply, or until we hear the story of another person who comes along with another financial scheme to rob thousands of their life savings, yeah, then all of a sudden I can resonate with that God of anger. Seems like the appropriate response. But you see, to take this story and to read it as a story that's talking about what happens to you when you die is to completely miss the point. See, Jesus never stops pointing to the divine image and the significance of people who are the easiest to pass by, the easiest to ignore, those who are the most likely to be forgotten and shut down. And it's like Jesus is saying in this story, this is the stuff God cares about. If you really want to know the heart of Christ, if you really want to know God's heart, this is the stuff God cares about. And see, we can understand why for modern day religious folks who have a roof over their head and food in their bellies, how it is so easy to miss the power of a passage like this and to make it about a different time and a different place in a different world, all while ignoring the very real suffering in this world. See, to read this passage and then debate about who's going where when they die, we miss it. We miss it. We miss the power of Jesus' insistence that God is all around us, especially in the places we're least likely to look. You see, and when we made the conversation about something else, I mean, no wonder so many people are giving up on the church project. Now, here's what's beautiful about this scripture. Because here Jesus is telling a story about people being invited into the kingdom that was prepared for them before the world was created. And the reaction is one of surprise. So what you don't have, what the story is not about, is people walking up boldly and confidently to the pearly gates and saying, "Look at me. I made it. I believed the right stuff. I had the right doctrine. I even behaved in the right way." No, they're surprised. I mean, this is a story about people saying, "Wait a minute. Us? I mean, when did we see you? What did we do to deserve it?" The sheep are surprised because they weren't doing it for some sort of reward. They were doing it because it's who they were and it's who they were called to be in their world. You see, if we're doing good in the world because we think there's some sort of reward at the end, then we might be missing it. And you see, if you always are seeing yourself as the cuddly little sheep And those other people, they're the goats. You know the people who they just don't see justice the way you see justice. They just don't care for people the way you care for suffering in the world. Oh, they just don't vote the ticket like you vote the ticket. You see, if they're always the goats, then we might be missing it. This is a story that is at its core asking us, who are we? And who are we called to be right here in this world? And here's the thing about sheep. You see, sheep, they always break the code. And in the ancient Greco-Roman world, in Jesus' world, the world of Jesus, they were firmly grounded in this social code of honor and shame. And so it would be considered really foolish to ever give to those at the bottom of the pyramid. Why would you give to them? They're the ones who are likely they'll never be able to pay you back. Why would you ever give food to the hungry? Why would you ever welcome in the stranger, the immigrant, the refugee, the ones who are likely never able to pay you back? I mean, why would you visit the prisoner? Why do these things? And in the ancient Greco-Roman world, in this system, this code of honor and shame, you were expected to order your relationships in exactly these ways. Asking the questions, what's in this for me? Is there a benefit in this for me? And if not, let's leave this relationship and keep on going. Oh, but not so for sheep. They're the ones always breaking the social and cultural codes. Why? Because it's who they are and it's who they're called to be in their world. And in this parable from Matthew's gospel, Jesus is telling a story about a king who separates sheep from goats. And see, I think what Jesus might be saying in this story is, I will always be found among the poor. I'll always be found among the suffering. I'll always be found with the hungry and the thirsty and the least of these. And I'm always going to take their side. And I get it. It can be really uncomfortable to imagine a God who's taking sides. Because I want God on my side, right? But this story is about a God who always acts on behalf of the suffering and the crushed. And maybe this is what it looks like for justice to roll down like waters. And it's as if Jesus in this story is saying, oh, y'all want to see me? Oh, y'all want to find me? Well, that's where I am. That's where I am. With the poor, with the suffering, with the abused, with the forgotten, with the least of these. That's where I am. And if you truly want to see me, you might have to start breaking some of the codes. My brothers and sisters, who are we? And who are we called to be in this world? And you know, as I was thinking about these questions this week, I started coming up with some ideas of how we might break the social codes of our day. And so I came up with 3 practical ways I think we can break the codes, and I realize there's hundreds of ways, and you may have your own list, but we have to start somewhere. So let's start with 3. And the first way I think we practically break the code is we start with questions. And do you notice how easy it is to not start with questions, but instead start with your agenda and start with your opinions, and you ask questions only to answer them? How do things look different when we start with questions? You know, last week I was at Denver International Airport, and I am absolutely convinced I could preach for an entire year on my experiences in airports, because fascinating things happen. But here we are in the airport, and we got there early because we're picking up my mom. The kids call her Nani. And we're picking up my mom, and we get there early because we're going to go in and surprise her. She comes up the escalator, and the girls, my daughters, even made these signs saying, "Welcome, Nani." And we get there, we park, we walk in the airport, and we find out that her flight is significantly delayed. And so we go up to the food court area, and we get a snack, and as we're eating our snack, we start hearing this commotion in the distance. And we can hear the chanting in the distance. No hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here. No hate, no fear. Refugees are welcome here. And now my daughter Shiloh, she's 4. She is absolutely fascinated by this, and she is curious as to what's happening. So we go over to the rail, and we look down, and we see this group of people, and they're holding up their signs. And she says, Pops, we got to go down there. And so she leads the way, and we walk down there. We go down the escalator. We walk up to this group of people. Hannah, who is standing just behind Shiloh, was there holding her sign, and Shiloh walks up to her. I'm not kidding. Just taps on her leg. And she had the most honest, genuine question. What are you guys doing here? And Hannah bends down and gets eyeball to eyeball with her, and in the most gentle way, she explains to Shiloh, my daughter, that they're there to break down barriers of fear and hate. And she said, we're here to let people know, all people know, that they are loved and welcomed. And I'm overhearing her tell this story to my daughter, and she's telling her that she's from Iraq and her family's still there and they're stuck. And for the next 20 minutes, Shiloh and Hannah stood side by side. Shiloh said, I need a sign. Takes a sign. And she said to Hannah, I also need that rose you're holding. And Hannah hands over the rose. And for 20 minutes, no hate, no fear. I mean, do you notice in this culture how easy it is to get caught up in all the political debates? Oh, and we need someone to blame. We need to find out whose fault this is. But see, as the church, as Christians, our starting place is different. We don't start there. We start with a very theological question, and that is, are they our brothers and sisters? Do you see them as your brothers and sisters? And I'm intentionally keeping them ambiguous because we have to name it every time we see it. Who's the them? The refugee, the immigrant, the religious other, the other race, the LGBT community, the poor, the broken, the marginalized, the oppressed, the least, the last, the forgotten, the least of these. Do we see them as our brothers and sisters? When we look at them, do we see the divine? That's our starting place. That's our first question. And when we start there, we are breaking the code. Who are we? And who are we called to be in this world? Number 2, for a practical idea of breaking the code. Recognize the difference between charity and justice. And before I go any further, I want to highlight and recommend for you this little book written by one of our very own in this congregation, Reverend Dr. Jim Ryan. It's a great little book called Doing Justice in a Purple Congregation. And in it, he has an entire chapter dedicated to the differences between charity and justice. They're both important, but they're different. And by the way, you can get this book. We have some at the Get Connected table for $10. Who's ever standing out there, if you want one of these, see one. If you don't have the $10 and you want to pay it later at a later date, you can do that too. Charity and justice, they're both important, but they're different. You see, charity seeks to meet the immediate need, and justice seeks systemic change. Justice asks the question about why is this happening? What are the things that are causing this kind of suffering? And you all are probably familiar with the story of the village by the river. And the villagers wake up one morning and they see all these babies floating down the river. And so the villagers jump in the river to rescue these babies. And on the second day, the same thing happens, and all the villagers jump in to rescue these babies. And on the third day, the same thing happens. But on this day, only some of the villagers jump in to rescue the babies, because some of the others decide to go upstream and see what in the heck is causing this. And that's how justice works. Justice always goes upstream to identify the structures of power that are causing the suffering. Charity meets the immediate need. Both are important. We absolutely need both of them. And see, when we ask those big questions of why, And when we see charity and justice as brothers and sisters linking arms and walking side by side, then we're breaking the code, the social code of our day that says, look out for you and your own. Who are we? Who are we called to be in this world? The third practical idea for us being code breakers is to take an honest look at ourselves in the mirror and be honest. Are we operating out of fear? Are we building relationships with the suffering world? And what's our life about? And when you look at your life, what's it about? What's this church about? If people in the community are to ask you, what's St. Luke's about, how do you respond? Are we people who start with the question of, do we see the divine in them? Are they our brothers and sisters? Are the least of these our brothers and sisters? Do we take seriously the ideas of both charity and justice? I mean, who are we? Who are we called to be in this world? So I want to close with a song. Raise your hand if you know the band Gungor. A few of you in this room. Even if you didn't raise your hand, you probably know them. They wrote the song called Beautiful Things. We've sang that song several times in this congregation. You know, they released a new song just this week. And it's a song that's called Who We Are. And it's a song about the refugee crisis we face in our world today. And I recognize that when we're doing a series on justice and justice rolling down like waters, there's all kinds of issues. There's all kinds of ways to be involved. And this is one of them. It may be one of the more pressing issues in our day. And they certainly have a passion for it. But see, they released the song this week on social media. And when they did, they attached a little note to it. And I want to read to you a portion of this note because it has everything to do with justice and what we're talking about this morning and in this series. And then we'll watch the video and hear the song together. So Gungor is Michael and Lisa Gungor. They're a couple. And here's what they wrote. I'm just going to read a portion of it. Growing up as a Christian and an American, I always had a sense that I was on the good team. I was told our country was founded on ideals like freedom and justice for all. I was told our faith in Jesus led us to be the salt and light of the world. We were the sheep, not the goats. We were the ones who welcomed the stranger, took care of the widow and the orphan. Our country was made of immigrants, and our motto was, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But now as I look out at America and Christianity within it, I wonder, is that really who we are? Our world is fraught with tension right now, and almost everyone has someone to blame. The problem is the immigrants. The problem is Donald Trump. The problem is the Democrats. Everyone has a scapegoat to blame all of our problems on, but perhaps we would do well to take a moment and examine the log in our own eye before we try to fix anyone else's vision. Forget politics for a moment and ask yourself this question. Is your heart with these people? Or are you caught up in your own fear or ego? This is a sincere question for both conservatives and liberals. It's possible to fight for immigrants' rights because that's the liberal and enlightened thing to do and still have no love or compassion in your heart for the people you are fighting for. So let me ask you again, do you feel love and compassion for these 65 million people? Do you see them as your brothers and sisters, as Christ himself? The real issue here is what kind of people are we? Are we the kind of people who open our hearts to others in their suffering, or the kind who get afraid and turn our hearts away? Here's the song, Who We Are, and I invite you to reflect.